So hello everyone. I'm really happy to have with us Sam Fabian today. So Sam is a research associate in Imperial College London, doing spectacular work on reconstructing visual control and aerial maneuvers of insect flights. Before he did PhD in University of Cambridge with Paloma Gonzalez Belido, working on predatory flights. And I will not take any more time. So thank you so much for being with us here.
Oh, no, thank you very much, Einat, and thank you all to inviting me here and to hosting me and getting to see your wonderful city, even without the fog occasionally, which has been wonderful. My name's Sam, and I'm here to tell you about some of the rules that underlie insect aerial combat. Before I go on, I'd like to thank some of the people Einat just mentioned, which includes my PhD advisor on the left here, Paloma Gonzalez Belido, and Dr. Hui-T Lin, who is my current advisor and mentor. Also my international collaborators and all the lovely people who give me tax money to work on such wonderful creatures. And as an overview of what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to start with how I have been getting data for everything that I'm going to show you. And then we're going to move between some different themes. There's going to be some jumps, but I like jumping around and seeing some different stuff. So we're going to start with predation, and then we're going to move on to mating in the air and how that might be working. I'm going to talk a little bit about fighting and what changes when you're fighting another animal of the same size and same capability as you. And then a little bit that's a bit more of a puzzle. Some stuff that doesn't quite fit with how we currently discuss everything that I'm going to be talking about before. And at the end, hopefully, where I see it going in the future. Again, funding willing. So to start about how I collect data, I mean, there has never been an easier time to collect data than now. And especially in behavior, where the advances in camera technology have really changed the landscape that we can operate in. And the nice thing now is you can take cameras to the animals rather than just taking animals to the cameras. You can now buy, for about £5,000, cameras that will shoot in HD at 1,000 frames per second off a battery. And you can wire these up, as we had rather dangerously, to an electric bike battery, and you can run them for hours. So you can sit sweating it out in a swamp, staring at dragonflies, filming all of these wonderful creatures, and you can go outside and get sunburnt and get bitten, and it's great. But these videos are only so good. What can we do with them? So this is a false-colored black and white video. It's not actually in purple, but you're going to see some dragonflies come in, and the very first thing that will be familiar to lots of you is getting rid of that background. And then you can add another filter or several filters on top of that to start getting rid of all these little background elements so that you can identify exactly where, in this case, two dragonflies are undergoing some behavior. But then, this is only in pixel coordinates, and something that I'm sure will be familiar to lots of you is that you need to turn these pixel coordinates into something like reality, a reconstruction of 3D. And so the way I've been doing that in the field is by checkerboard calibration. So you can use known size checkerboards to reconstruct 3D space, and then anything that those two cameras can see, given that they're taking pictures at the same time, can be reconstructed in 3D. And so we can really start measuring the geometry, the speeds, the accelerations of different insects in the field. And that means that we can start approaching their behavior rather than simply looking at it and thinking what's happened, but start fitting models. And to start all this off, I'm going to be talking about work I did during my PhD, which is on predation on this absolutely wonderful little creature. This is a robber fly. This one's only found in North America, but you'll find robber flies during the summer out here as well. And you can see right here in this photo on the right, I hope, quite how weird those eyes are. And those eyes only get weirder the closer you look. I'm not here to talk about vision, but if you want to talk about vision, these are crazy. This fly is 6 or 7 millimeters long, yet has the visual resolution of a dragonfly. And it's basically strapped, for want of a better term, a telescope to the front of its vision. It has terrible peripheral vision, but fantastic long-range vision. It can see a tiny little fruit fly over the distance of about 1.5 meters and fly up and go and get it, which, given the scale of the insect, is a very impressive feat. And when it comes to eyes, and eyes alone, bigger is better. So the fact they're able to do it with such a small eye is incredible. But this also works when we give them a fake target. And so here you can see this little robber fly going up and hitting what it thought was a nice tasty food, and actually turns out to be a bit of plastic because somebody is being really mean to this fly. And they're able to do this over the course of a human eye blink. They're navigating their way into the target. And so I set off in my PhD to try and understand how this behavior is organized. How does this work? So we can take reconstructions, which is what you're going to see on the left, where the robber fly is in red and the target is in blue. And there's what we call the line of sight. It's also called a range vector that connects them. That doesn't mean that's where exactly the vision of this is pointing, but it means where it would see the target. So it's a geometric rather than a visual marker. You're going to see here that as our little fake target, oh, there's my pulse, goes across from left to right, that robber fly is going up from underneath to go and hit it. That's quite a classic dragonfly type interception. And it's not just a pursuit, it's an interception, because this factors in the movement of the target. It's aiming ahead of where the target is now towards where it's going to be in the future. But how's it doing that? How's it doing that? Because that's quite a difficult thing to do. That requires you to know the distance, the size, the speed, all of these kind of geometric principles. And you need to know them quickly because you're a small fly and that thing's going overhead fast. So is it possible they just make an assessment right at takeoff and it's all pre-planned? And so we thought about this. It's like, well, what happens if your target changes direction midway? Is your fly able to deal with this? Is it able to adapt? And so here you're going to see a target that's veering all over the place, which is very, very complicated. It's just a bead on the end of a piece of string. And here you can see that this robber fly is adapting its flight course over time and very quickly switching onto new interception courses. It's constantly adapting its course. So that means this is a feedback loop. There is feedback coming from the target. Something that can be visually measured by this fly is telling it how to adjust its flight course. So how could you do this with a brain that is smaller than the size of a sesame seed? Well, actually, there's a very, very simple rule that we currently implement in engineering. Unfortunately, the engineered systems we happen to use it in look like this. So let's swap that out for a nice little fly instead. But maybe we can use the missile to understand the fly. And the way in which we implement this in missiles is that you have a target angular rate. Just means how fast you're seeing that target move in your visual field. And you linearly correlate it to your lateral acceleration, otherwise called your centripetal acceleration or steering. So if you see a target that's moving from left to right at a certain angular rate, you turn to the right at an angular rate that is larger than you observe. So do we find this kind of linear correlation between the lateral acceleration and the target angular rate in the fly? Well, it would be a bit of a boring talk if we didn't. So this is what it looks like for this robber fly here. And you see that, yeah, all right, it's a bit noisy, but there's a slope there. And that suggests that they are using this information. And the slope that is given here is the gain. It's how visual information is being transferred into behavioral output, or at least a way of representing that's happening. It might be a much more complex system happening underneath, but this is a kind of a reductive approach that we can take. But then we could also look at a completely different predatory fly. This is the killer fly, Coenosia attenuata. It's only about 5 millimeters long, tiny, tiny little fly, and yet you still get a linearity, but the gain is different, the slope is different. The way in which it's processing the visual information and performing the behavioral output, it looks very similar, but it requires a different amount of visual stimulation to create the same behavioral output or vice versa. So why would you change gain? Why would you change your tuning to what you're visually seeing? Well, they don't live in the same place. Robber flies live out in the open, sitting on top of a stick, waiting for things to fly overhead and hunting them nice and distant. Killer flies are real brawlers. They're down in the undergrowth, flying in between reeds and other, grass and other elements, and they will miss and come back again. So their behavior might be matched to their environment. And in the case of the robber fly, if we fit a gain to a simulation using the robber fly, it works really well against targets that are relatively low maneuverability and are being chased from far away. Now, if you're far away, if you imagine you're on a train or something, you look at some mountains, they're passing very slowly. You're used to low angular rates, so you might have to steer in proportion to very low angular rates. But if you're the killer fly and your prey is much, much closer and zooming around, well, that's like looking at the train carriage window and seeing stuff that's much faster. It's going past really fast, and you might tune your gain down. It turns out that when you have a really evasive target that's at close range, lower gains tend to be more effective. You can start applying our understanding, this kind of reductive model, to start understanding, well, why would the behavior of these different animals that are fundamentally solving the same task, hitting a small moving target, but why would they do it differently? Or how would they tune that behavior to fit the ecological circumstances? But what if somebody's even meaner to this poor little fly who's just trying to catch a meal? And this here is an obstacle. It's a black acetate sheet that I've spread in the way of this little robber fly who's down in the bottom right to try and catch this target in the top left. And you're going to see here that the robber fly doesn't just go up and fly straight into this acetate sheet. Instead, in this case, she is veering far forwards and then rising up. It's taken a path that avoids this obstacle, which already tells us that something a little bit extra is going on. This fly is not totally zoned in and only able to see the target. It is able to process the visual stimulation of an obstacle. So it's able to solve these two problems. And there's all kinds of very complex models that we could use to describe this behavior. I started with something very, 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 very basic. We start with this target interception that simply uses the angular rate of the target to go and hit the target with, and we can fit a gain for different situations. But then simply adding an obstacle avoidance algorithm based on visual loom. So if something's getting bigger in your visual field, you steer away from it. And if it's getting bigger faster, you steer away faster. And it's that simple. It's really a very basic solution. But what happens if we add these together? So if one of them's telling you to turn right and the other's telling you to turn left, you turn somewhere in between. Well, fitted with appropriate gains, you're going to see multiple different trajectories here. You're going to see the real fly go in white after the target's up here in white. You're going to see pure interception. That's just that angular rate stuff that I was talking about. And then also an obstacle avoidance algorithm implemented with the interception. And you see here that the real fly surging forwards is matching this obstacle avoidance summation, unlike a pure interceptive trajectory, which would just go straight up and hit the target. And so it's quite weird that we can use the most basic possible models that probably aren't accurate to actually the neurobiology of what's going on inside the brain. Yet the behavior itself starts fitting a very, very basic rule. But then moving on after the PhD, what other animals can we start applying these kinds of methods to? And so I'm going to talk about mating with mayflies and these wonderful creatures that actually you'll get all around the edges of Lake Constance during the summer as well. I think the German is Eintagsflieger, because it's the one-day fly. Mayflies are weird. They're really, really, really weird. And I would happily tell you for the rest of your time, I'd run out of audience quite quickly, about mayflies. But I think they're really remarkable and often overlooked. They don't feed as adults. Whatever fuel they come out with from being a nymph in the water is all they've got to go on. This is a male, and you can tell that because he's got stonking great forelegs that extend all the way out here and are actually reversibly jointed, so they can fold backwards, which is what he uses to catch the female. Very weird. There's a tail here that extends for twice the length of the body out the back. You can see that it's actually got one set of wings here, and it's actually got what looks like a vestigial sort of coupled wing. We'll come on to talk about whether that's vestigial later. And then these ridiculous eyes. Not all mayflies look like this. Lots of them lose these hind wings. That seems to be an evolutionary trend. But what is this mayfly, this really weird little creature who's more closely related to dragonflies and damselflies than any other insect? What does it spend its time doing? Because it's not feeding, it's not hunting like dragonflies and damselflies. They tend to be fairies. All summer long, they're sitting in fields in shafts of sunlight, or actually late into the evening tends to be when you really see them come out. And they're doing this. They're running up and down stairs, almost like a dance, and it gets called the nuptial dance. These are little mayflies that are parachuting down, so completely passive, and then climbing back up. I told you that this only has the energy budget it emerged with. It's only got so much fuel. Now, if you have a certain amount of fuel with which you can find a female, why the hell are you using it to run up and down stairs all day? Because all of these are males. That's pretty weird. It's a really weird behavior. And so using these lovely new camera systems that we're able to do, you can take cameras out into the field and get tracks that look like this. There's a 3D trajectory of the mayfly showing you quite how horizontally localized. It really is just this patch of space going up and down. So what are the possible explanations that we could describe? Switching between these vertical speeds of very consistent vertical speeds. Same speed on descent as you really get on ascent. It's really repeatable. It's not exactly a pattern, they're not always going between the same heights and it take different times. It's not like it's always half a second to go up and down. That varies a little bit. It's previously been described as a display. It's showing off to the females. It's like, look at me. Look at how big my wings are. And the trouble I have with this is the female visual system in this group is pretty terrible. Females fly at high altitude, maybe 2-3 meters above the water or above any foliage, cruising nice and high, looking at a background contrast of murky ground on which they're going to see a murky brown male trying to say, hey, look at my wings. There's something else that could be a factor in this. The other complication here is I've just told you about how all these males are grouped together doing this, and they're waiting for a female. How do they know what a female looks like? I was talking with so many different people, and then we had all these really exciting, beautiful ideas for how they were able to filter out exactly what a female looks like, and they must have all these complex filters. Because the females, I'm afraid I don't have a photo, but basically to eye, if I showed you them, you wouldn't know which is which until you measured the legs and this sort of thing. The problem, well, this is what an interception looks like. Here, that's your female, that's your male. I mean, does that look very different to that? Especially when it's late in the evening and you're looking at a silhouetted contrast of something moving fast overhead, it's a bit of a challenge. More of a problem with this is the fact that male mayflies are idiots that don't know what females look like at all. Male mayflies are sexually attracted to moving objects, and that's it. That is the extent of what male mayflies. They will chase a bird. They will chase a 5 centimeter, I think in a second I'll switch to a 5 centimeter sphere, and yet if I let him, this male will go up and underneath and start trying to couple and try to bring his claspers, his sexual reproductive organs, into play with a black sphere 5 centimeters. Right. So that doesn't look like a super advanced filter, right? That looks like a very, very reductive, very, very basic filter going on. And yet somehow, all these males that hang out tend not to capture it. They do capture each other. There's a little bit of gay sex that's happening between the mayflies, but it tends to be very short-lived. And actually, given the density, while we're filming, we might see it every half hour. And this is for a high-density swarm. And so these males are still visually telling each other apart, or visually distinguishing an object that's coming overhead from one that's doing this dance. So could this dance be related to separating which is a male and which is a female of the mayflies? Well, we can also use this to look at the interception pattern that we see. So here you've seen that the mayfly, much like I've shown you with the robber fly, and it's also how it works with dragonflies when they're intercepting prey, stays underneath its target. So here, you're seeing a mayfly going back and forth, and it's actually an interceptor. Again, it's moving to the future meeting point with the target. So can we use the same model that I was describing earlier, which is just based on visual target angular rate, the angular rate of the motion of that target. And we get some pretty nice linear fits, although they seem to sort of saturate out. And that means that there's a limit to how much force any flying insect can apply. And above a certain range, you can't just infinitely continue linear. You're going to run out of, I have no more turn to give. And we see a delay of 60 milliseconds, and delay is going to come important, but bear in mind, this is pretty standard. Between 40 and 60 milliseconds for most of these systems is what we model them as being, which is shorter than most of our visual reflexes, but it's still okay. Yeah, we can kind of understand how neurons and muscles and stuff would create forces with a 60 millisecond lag. That makes some sense. Now, using reconstructions, we can see that actually when they're doing this bobbing flight or nuptial dance, a male mayfly is mostly seeing other male mayflies near the horizon, almost always, and they're almost always traveling in a vertically elevation rate pattern. If we look at the targets that they chase, they only ever chase stuff that's overhead. And in fact, it massively increases as you get towards the zenith, and they're very, very likely to chase almost anything in any shape or pattern that's in the zenith. It's a bit of a problem because we can't just make targets appear that are stationary, and I'd love to be able to do that. But certainly you can move them very, very slowly into place. The mayflies still chase it, or you can move them very, very fast and the mayflies still try and get it. And so it seems like it might be quite a simple filter that by going up and down, they're not flying over each other's heads. And by doing that, if you're a male mayfly, you avoid being intercepted by other male mayflies, and that's beneficial for both of you because both of you aren't going to waste time on this interaction. But can we take that interception system and try to understand it as, is there anything else we could add to this vertical up and down behavior that we've seen so far? So if we imagine there's a sort of danger zone, there's this kind of region of contrast above them where they're silhouetting objects against the sky, where if they see something, they can chase it. But actually, if anything drops out of this, they will stop chasing it. You can test this with an artificial target. If you move it along and then drop it down below the horizon, male mayfly instantly stops. Can't decide if that's a choice. It might just be I can't see it unless it's background contrasted. But if we take a simulation of the interceptor that we've seen so far, it's great at hitting even evasive targets that go side to side on the horizontal plane. Stays underneath them, keeping it silhouetted against the sky, goes up, catches it. Really, really nice. But actually, if you start trying to chase something that's going vertically up and down, the most effective evasive tactic is to start heading back downwards, and you're going to drop straight out of that vertical cone that's above the other male. And so traveling up and down vertically would be the most effective way to shake off a mayfly that's trying to intercept you. And so it's hard to conclusively state, there may be many other factors, but it certainly seems an effective way of separating males and males avoiding conflict by going in this weird flight path that we see over the fields. And so, yeah, we have this passive descent and this powered climb may be about male avoidance more than it is about display. There's something else that comes out really, really weirdly when we start looking at this system. As what's going to happen here is this mayfly is chasing a target, goes to make a corner, and it's just opened that tail. You're going to see it here. These long caudal filaments, these long strings that come out, streamers that come out the back of the insect. Every time they make a turn, they slap them as wide open as possible. Now, if you are a desperate male mayfly on a limited energy budget, you want to hit that female as quickly as possible because there's 5 other males chasing at the same time. Why are you doing this? Because this sure as hell looks like an air brake. Looks like you're activating a braking system. And why would you want to brake if you want to get to that female as quickly as possible? Well, we can start looking at this from the actual trajectory. So here you have a mayfly trajectory. And then we have the actual just total net acceleration that this trajectory is doing. We then can devolve it into 2 components. Centripetal acceleration, I'm sorry, I called it lateral acceleration earlier. I'm using them interchangeably. That's just acceleration that turns you. It changes direction. But of course, there's the acceleration that we generally mean when we intuitively talk about acceleration, and that's tangential acceleration. That's changing in speed. So can we start looking at maybe the tail opening as a way to control how much you're slowing down, and then maybe bring it together and input through flapping of increasing your tangential acceleration, going positive. If we take these trajectories where the mayfly is chasing the targets, going backwards and forwards up into the target, we get a pattern that looks like this for tangential acceleration. Remember, that's change in speed. So here, what we're seeing is every time the mayfly is going in, it's going blue, and then every time the mayfly is coming out of a turn, it's going orange-yellow. That means it is slowing down every time it's going into a turn and speeding up outside of a turn. Now that actually starts to make a bit of sense. Why would you want to do this? Well, is it because this changes something about your steering pattern? But also you'd get this passively, wouldn't you? Now, if you are driving your car and you don't hit the brakes, you're going to hit a skid, which is generally bad for road safety. But actually you would start decelerating anyway. And here we can see that the body is already going side onto the airstream and slowing down. But the tail opening really suggests that this is an active component. And there's another element which suggests it's an active component. So here you're going to see a mayfly who's pursuing a target. And he's going to start making this turn and pop. And I'll let this play one more time. And suddenly I'll let you know that those hind wings don't look as vestigial as they were before. They're no longer just synced up. They're being popped out as little emergency air brakes right at the apogee of the turn. Right as that turn is at its max, they pop out the hind wings as a little air brake. That's an extremely repeatable behavior. So every time they're making a turn, they go from flying in synchrony between the hind wings and forewings, and those are always the same. And every time they make a turn, they decouple them, and suddenly those hind wings are being popped forwards. Now, I was talking about deceleration and why deceleration might be useful. So we can talk about this in terms of turn radius. And a turn radius, smaller is better, because that makes you more agile or maneuverable. The smaller your turn radius, the tighter the corner that you are trying to make. So if we plot the speed of the animal versus its turn radius, you can see that this is very nicely constrained. Mayflies seem to be momentum limited. That means at high speeds, they can only make quite wide turns. Up to at high speeds, they only seem to make turns that are a radius of a meter. Whereas as they cut that speed, even shifting from 3 to 1 meter per second, which is a very reasonable deceleration during this turn, suddenly that turn radius is way, way smaller. It drops by a factor of 10. So if you are chasing a female and she turns back on herself, suddenly, instead of going on a 1 meter wide turn all the way around, you can make a much tighter turn if you start braking. These are things that are intuitive to us, but it's interesting to see insects actually actuating them in their steering system. And then we can take this principle and start talking about understanding how it might be beneficial during interception. So we can use fixed speed interceptors that always retain the same speed using the steering algorithm I've talked about so far. And we see that that's constantly overshooting, goes way too high and can't make the turn. It's going too fast. Or you could travel really slowly, but then you never catch the target. We can use the model for how the mayflies are changing their speed to much more reliably go and hit a target and stay underneath it and stay on it. Testing kind of the theory behind why they might be decelerating during these corners. But then it's also, you're still chasing a female who has different aims to you as a male mayfly in this instance. The female might want something different. It flies in a different way. We actually don't have that much data on how the females fly. That's quite a different question to dogfighting, which is an English term that may not translate well, but it means mutual combat between fighter aircraft. And we're going to talk about dogfighting with dragonflies, and that's a real dragonfly wing. This is Rhyothymus fuluginosa. It's the most fantastic. It's called butterfly wing dragonfly. Incredible. You get them in Taiwan, which is where I've been doing field work, but not on that species, but on this one. This is Trithymus aurora. It's a It's called the crimson, what's it called? Crimson dropwing, that's it, which is a wonderful name to call it. Because what this does is sit on tops of sticks, being red and being extremely angry all day long. And they are very angry about red things. They tend not to bother other blue dragonflies, but any other red dragonfly is getting pummeled. Well, we'll come on to actually whether it gets pummeled. It gets annoyed. We'll certainly say that. The catching behavior of the dragonfly is very similar to what I showed you with the robberfly before. It's an interception. You have a dragonfly that rises up from underneath to go and hunt this tiny little, poor little Drosophila or gnat or mosquito or whatever it might be. Now, fundamentally, I think this is cheating. I mean, it's a great way to get lunch, but this is just not a fair contest. This is rude, frankly. That's very much, if you're this tiny little fruit fly, that's very much like you're flying your happy little Cessna 172 and this guy turns up on your tail. That's not an awful lot you can do. You can try for a last-minute turn, but good luck, That's basically you're cooked. But if you're another dragonfly, another male dragonfly who's interested in this interaction, it's a bit like you happen to also be flying an F-22 Raptor. There's maybe a little bit more that you could do during this interaction. It's still not an ideal situation. You want to be the one chasing. But what can you do? Do the interactions between like aircraft, like dragonflies, do they resemble these kind of nice interceptions? Is that how male dragonflies annoy each other? Well, if you sat around a lake or a pond, that's not true. You start seeing this kind of behavior that just instantly, visually, qualitatively looks completely different. You don't get nice, smooth intercepts where they go and hit each other. You get what appears more like a dance or a dogfight. And I might call it a dance because weirdly in this species, I talked about pummeling, they never actually touch. It's a really, really weird factor that we should bear in mind the whole way through, is that the males never actually hit each other in the species. Other species, yeah, these guys just show off. Just a little flash of red, a little show my tail, that seems to be enough. But how does the control in these work? What does the actual control system that underlies this? What is the behavior? Can we get a phenomenological model of the behavior and then start to understand the interactions that we're observing? Well, we can take lots and lots of trajectories. I think this is somewhere in the region of 1,000 trajectories from the field of these interactions between like dragonflies, all in the same species around the same pond. And we can map out visual locations where you see the target. That's azimuth, that's where it is along the horizon. I'm sure many of you will have seen maps not dissimilar from this. And the other is elevation, that's where it is vertically. So if it's -90, it's directly beneath you. If it's 90, it's in the zenith of the sky. And then this is relative to where the dragonfly is currently heading. So we think that's where the body is pointing generally. And we get this really, really kind of clear-cut map colored by how our dragonfly that we're looking at, how did it react to seeing a target here? And this is actually really, really boring. This is, if your target is on your right, you turn right. If your target's on your left, you turn left. This is a pursuit controller. This is the most basic possible kind of position servo you could have, which is if something's on my right, I turn towards it. If it's further on my right, I turn faster. Right? We see a similar thing in elevation, but there's a slight little hint of a puzzle here, which is that the actual inflection between where you turn up towards a target and where you turn down is not at the horizontal, it's slightly above it. It's about 15 to 20 degrees beneath. 15 to 20 degrees above the elevation. What does that mean? That means dragonflies, when facing each other, are aiming below their targets. They're aiming beneath them. And we can start thinking about why that might be important when we combine these figures into the Eye of Sauron and we stare directly into it. Right, so this is just the color is showing you the mean turn rate for a dragonfly that's seeing a target in different visual areas. So we see that they turn very, very strongly when they see targets in their lateral visual field, high in elevation. And you still get it below them, but it's much weaker when it's against contrast of the ground. We have this region in the middle where they don't seem to turn much, and we think of that as being the goal region. That's where they want the visual target to be. They want to be aiming directly at it. But we also see this big black region here and here. Well, where's that? That appears to be either a behavioral or a visual blind spot, and we cannot separate those two. We don't know when a dragonfly decides not to react to something and when it can't see it. But certainly to targets that are behind them or through their body, there's no regular turning behavior. So we get this map. So what are these arrows here? They're telling me which direction is the dragonfly that's seeing the target turning and how is that moving the target. And so that's showing that if you see a target here, they're going to turn to the right, which makes the target move left, and it's pushing this visual target into this region that is slightly forward, well, it's forward and it's slightly elevated in the visual field. So this is a very, very simple control system. It simply says, point at the target. But the behavior is very different to the thing that I was talking about earlier with this target angular rate. Because instead of just heading straight for a meeting point with the target, which is what everything I've been talking about so far, you want to go and catch lunch, this is what you do. Instead, what this is going to do is you chase the current target location, the target moves, and you're going to end up coming in behind it. And so we can add all of the different elements that I've shown you so far together with the target azimuth, the target elevation controller, and also time delay. And we get a dragonfly-like behavior out of this model where it chases after the target. And in this case, you're seeing that actually, he's not going and hitting it. He's flying around it and chasing it and staying tight on the 6 behind it. But what happens, like how can we use this to start explaining differences in the actual behavior that we're observing? So here you're going to see 2 dragonflies where blue is staying very close on the heels of red. And all the time it's basically staying in this really locked kind of visual position. But then occasionally we have things that look like this, which we affectionately call showboating or overshooting or spiraling, where we're seeing the dragonfly looping around the target. And this emphasizes again that collision really isn't driving these interactions, that the criteria for success have shifted because in each one of these, red is traveling much faster than blue. Red could go and hit blue quite easily. That's well within its capabilities, and yet the control system doesn't drive collision. Can we get the differences between these overshooting trajectories and the kind of tight follow-away trajectories using the same controller, or does it require a change in gain or something? But actually, if you feed exactly the same controller with just 2 different speeds, you get quite dissimilar behavior. If you have a very slow pursuer who's matched to the same speed as the target, you get very neat following. But if you have a fast pursuer who's maybe twice the speed, you start getting the showboating and you fly around. And so actually you can operate very similar control. You can react in pretty much the same way, but depending on how much speed you have in the interaction, and speed could be correlated to things that are a little bit softer to talk about like motivation, you get quite dissimilar visual behavior. But this isn't really getting at what's so special about these interactions. And that's about to happen here. You've got 2 dragonflies spiraling around, and then something really special just happened there that you never get in predatory interactions, as far as I'm aware. There are no examples I know of where a moth turns around and eats a bat. That is an asymmetric interaction. Your moth is only hoping to get away, at best. In this interaction, these are 2 mutual combatants. Both of them can win. Either of them could chase the other out of the territory, and so there should be a way to switch between who is chaser and who is not. And right here, you're going to see the leading dragonfly become the chasing dragonfly. So it's going from a bad position into what we might think of as a good position. So how's that done? Is that like a pre-programmed maneuver? Or can we start to explain it using the very basic control system I've been talking about? Well, first we have to define some geometries. So we have red advantage. That means that you are doing the chasing. So that is, your red dragonfly is an advantage. It's chasing the blue dragonfly. You have the blue advantage, right? That's the swap. You can also have the other geometries, which are mutual advantage or mutual disadvantage, where you're both going to hit each other. We assume that that's not terribly beneficial for either party. And then we have neutral no advantage. So those tend to be temporary elements. So if we look across these different classes, either one's following the other, or there's some other geometry that's happening, which sort of geometries tend to dominate? And so if we can group this by looking at the error angle, the angle between where the dragonfly is heading and where it sees the target as being, and we get a map that looks like this, where the vast majority of the time you get these quite neat chasing interactions, where one of them is chasing the other. Most of the time they're in that configuration. But again, how do we swap? If you're in this state, how do I get here? You're going to have to go through neutral, go through mutual advantage, but you're going to have to change the system. Well, when we look at and we size out the elements of the trajectories where this happens, you're going to see this over and over again here. Blue is always starting being chased, but red loses that advantage. And if you see, blue every time is doing this downward spiral. It turns a full loop in the horizontal plane to get down. It's also going vertically down, and that's very, very repeated and regular. Each time the pattern is slightly different, but the actual kind of the chain of actions that are leading to this pattern seem to be relatively consistent. It's this downward spiral. So if we take our simulation that we were showing earlier, and we take both of them and we run them against each other, so same simulation but slightly different geometry, same visual kind of feedback, except being fed different information because they're at different angles relative to each other, we see that the initial evader will do this downward loop and get round and behind the initial chaser, getting down and behind it into this kind of low reaction zone very, very quickly, such that the initial chaser only slightly curves towards it. But when you start doing this, if you change the the pattern just a little bit, you get something a bit weird coming out, and it looks like this. This is where an initial chaser and an initial evader lock onto each other and start spiraling down towards each other. All right? And this is something that happens all the time in simulations, and it's terribly annoying because they're just going to keep going like that. That's then a stable structure. But do real dragonflies do this? And I'd argue, yes, that they do. It's not stable. But here we have mutual spirals that go down in descent. We can find they tend to be short-lived, tend to only maximize at about, maximally be about 8 revolutions as they go down, but they're always these downward spirals. This feature that we've seen in the simulations appears to be there in the data set. Fold blue actually gets the drop on red and gets around behind. So we get these downward spirals where these two interactors, so these are real trajectories where they go down and towards each other. That's a repeatable motif. It's quite a rare one, but it happens a lot, and it tends to happen between individuals who have territories right next to each other. We can think about why that might be the case. But what about, is this a dragonfly-specific modality? Well, stupid question. Of course it's not. You also get it in butterflies. These are night-flying, chasing butterflies, and they are doing a downward spiral. We're looking up at them, so it's quite hard to see the vertical dimension. These two little butterflies are spiraling around each other, steering mutually towards each other during this chase. And these are really high-turning behaviors. These are quite challenging for the animal to do because they're also having to visually track whilst making these high-speed maneuvers. And even the things like lesser houseflies, these little houseflies that come and sit underneath your lampshade, if you watch them, you'll see that suddenly two of them will hit each other, spiral around and descend towards the ground. You get these little spins that happen. And this is what this looks like with tangential acceleration, change in speed, and we get this pattern that emerges. It's relatively consistent between visual chasers. Now what's weird is that's very consistent because we already know about it. It's what we teach pilots to do when they're being chased. It is one of the Air Combat Maneuvering Handbook's recipes for how you get yourself out of the situation of being chased. And it's difficult to make quantitative assessment because actually finding these trajectories in a way that's comparable tends to be quite challenging. You have to do a lot of persuasion. But at least visually, and they show it to pilots and they're like, oh yeah, they're doing exactly what we would do in that situation. It turns out that maybe, even though the systems are completely different, there's only so many ways of getting onto each other's tail, and this chasing behavior may re-emerge with the same patterns over and over again. But we can start taking other principles from flying aircraft as well. And it's things like this. This map will tell you how maneuverable, it's a very simplified version, but it's how maneuverable is your plane. You have an airspeed along the bottom, and you have a maximum speed, and that's your thrust-to-weight ratio, and you have a minimum speed, which is your stall speed. There's not enough air going over your wings. You're flying a brick, you're going to crash. Not good. Bad. So we have this airspeed, and across the range, this range, we have the turn rate. And at low speeds, you can't turn very fast. There's not enough air going over the wings to generate the flight forces needed to turn. So you need to go faster. But if you start going, that's a problem of force generation. You're not generating enough turning force. Modern planes have some ways around that involving moving their thrusters around and all kinds of funny things. But then up here, well, why can't we just continue turning at the same rate? Well, that's a problem of force tolerance. That's that either the pilot or your plane are going to start falling to pieces, and that's generally considered not great. So we have this pattern of force tolerance and force generation. What does the map, if we plot airspeed versus turn rate for different insects, what does that start looking like? So take the same map, we map it out for some of the different insects I've shown you so far. I have the dragonfly here, I have the housefly and the mayfly, and you start seeing these similar curves that they always seem to be constrained by turn rate at high speed. And that the slower they go, the more maneuverable they are. And that's probably why, even when dragonflies are fighting, you might think, okay, foot to the floor, let's go as fast as possible. Much like a real fighter plane, they don't always travel at their maximum speed, because then they turn like a small, ocean liner. Instead, they tend to be fighting right down about 2 meters per second, which is way smaller than their top speed, which is between 8 and 10 meters per second. Whereas we get slightly different maps when we look at the housefly and the mayfly, but overall we seem to see this. But notice that they're not stalling. And that's wonderful because they're flapping. They're able to redirect thrust. They're able to produce that thrust, and many of these systems are able to hover or come very close to a hover. So they don't stall. Slow speed's no problem. But high speed does start costing you. And so that links into what we were talking about with the mayflies and using those deployable air brakes to gain maneuverability. But of course, this looks weirdly consistent. Could it just be something about the filtering? Have I just done my 3D trajectories wrong? That's your Drosophila. And you start seeing why this is just not a fair comparison if you're talking about these chasing systems. The poor little fruit fly is frankly hopeless when it comes to creating high force turns. And that chasing, I would argue, probably is driving this turning performance that we're seeing in these. There are other reasons that you might have this emerge, but it looks like poor little Drosophila is not really being selected for that. There's also differences in how the turning force, the centripetal acceleration that's being generated, varies with flight speed. So that you can think about this as g-force, where 10 meters per second squared, 9.81 meters per second squared is 1g. So this is about 2g, 4g, about 6g, 8g. And in the Dragonfly, as they go at higher speeds, we're seeing greater g-forces come out. That's not enough to actually turn them faster, but the force is getting higher and higher, even though the actual turn rates are not keeping up. But weirdly, with the Housefly, you get more of a plateau. They really are able to generate pretty high turn forces at both low speed and towards their maximum speeds. There's not much of an advantage for the Housefly in terms of force generation from going faster. And a lot of this may have to do with differences in how these two systems fly. They're quite different flight systems. This one's much more similar to a quadcopter or a drone or something like this. You have very high wing loading, so there's lots of mass per unit area of the wing. We're seeing that their wing aspect ratio is much squatter. They've got kind of rounder wings. And the flight muscle connection is much closer to being driven on this continuous cycle, as opposed to the Dragonflies, who have this light wing loading, very low mass per amount of wing, and actually have direct control over each one of their wings. They can move and maneuver independently. And the thing that this allows Dragonflies to do, that as far as I know, no flies do, is this. Dragonflies glide. Dragonfly, and this is a vertical glide. You can see a little bit of flapping and then straight back into that glide. They're able to leverage passive aerial transport at the same time. So how could this be involved in the chasing and the fighting that we've been seeing so far? Well, naively, I assumed, well, they're not going to glide. They're not during this high impact, high chase scenario. You're not going to see these passive elements, but of course I'm dead wrong. About 30% of the time, and these are colored by whether the animals in these interactions are flapping or gliding, about 30% of the time to 40% of the time, they're actually gliding, which is really weird. And actually, it's not completely random. They're not just randomly switching between flapping and gliding. It depends on what they're doing. So if I show you here, these are colored by where purple is flapping and cyan is when they are gliding. You can see that's not just randomly distributed. Every time they're making a turn is when they're bringing their wings into bear. They're starting to flap, to reorient the body and change direction. But every time that they can travel in a straight line, maybe when they're doing the chasing a target that's dead ahead, you get this gliding coming out. And so we can regroup this on some different plots here, where the color is telling you what proportion of the time are they flapping or are they gliding. We see that gliding is really restricted to when you've got low turn rates and relatively low speeds, whereas you start flapping a lot more when you're really pushing your maneuverability envelope. That's when the flapping is coming out during these fights. And we can remap that into turn radius. So if you've got a high turn radius, okay, you're mostly traveling in a straight line, you tend to be gliding, but you swap to flapping. We can start thinking about whether or not flapping might be energetically costly, and what's the test here? Is it how much you can turn and add in this energy through this flapping? And is that what's being compared when these Dragonflies are doing these interactions? Because ultimately, so far, nothing I've told you tells you who wins or why they win. And that's a big open question and something that I think will be really fun to explore in the future. And then finally, I'm going to talk about something that doesn't really fit the models and is a bit weird and a bit fun. And it's these guys here, these wonderful houseflies called Vanea canicularis. And most of you should be familiar with them, even if you would rather not be, because they fly in through your windows and they do this underneath your lampshade. So contrast is a little weak here, but you're seeing a tiny little black speck traveling seemingly aimlessly around. And you can get quite a few of them sitting underneath a single lampshade during the summer months. As you found these all over the world. But this is not random. It's highly stereotyped behavior where your little fly, and there's a little reconstruction of one going around here, is making regular turns, regular spikes in the centripetal acceleration, regular amounts of turning effort being applied in between generally traveling straight lines. About every half second, they're making a turn that is on average pretty close to a right angle. And the result is this. You see this landmark and you see the patrol flight path that's happening. That's not just random idle. This is a territory. What you end up with is, we call it lone patrol, it's a territory. It's this patrol cloud which is occupied by this fly. And we actually don't know terribly well why a male fly wants this so much. It defines access to females in some way. It's not totally obvious to us why females love landmarks like lampshades. That's yet to be, obviously that may be a co-option of a natural behavior. In fact, it has to be, because lampshades have not been around terribly long. But we don't know why, but this certainly seems to be the male goal. This is a defensive, aggressive behavior that happens in our own living room, which is wonderful because, I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago there was a lot of sitting around in living rooms and not terribly much going on wonderful field trips. So it allowed me and my colleagues to study this kind of behavior that was happening in our own houses, even during COVID lockdowns, where you have these little houseflies patrolling their territory, and suddenly they're going to get bothered, and you see them tilt forward and enter into this fray. This is a chasing system that happens in a box, and it's a wild behavior. It's not being forced on them. That happens in a human environment. So I think this should make it in the future lab portable, right? Because most of the animals that we take from outside inside, they don't like being inside, because this is our situation. Houseflies come in of their own free will. But what happens once this male has entered into this chase? Well, it looks a little bit more like this, and you can see this often. You see these chases where red is chasing yellow, and then at some point, yellow's going to do something, whoop, yellow's now chasing red, and you get these complex interactions. It starts looking a bit like the dragonfly, but again, happening in your living room. I tell people this a lot, and they don't always see the joy in it, but I think this is marvelous. This is wildlife coming and giving you behavior. And these are unlike the dragonflies in that they will smack each other up. You can see here that they will catch each other by the wing and fling each other through the air during these spirals. We don't actually know how much damage this causes. There's a question here. Also, they intercept females in pretty much a similar way. So what may look very aggressive to us may not do them terribly much damage, but certainly being dragged around by your wings is probably not what you want out of this interaction, we would assume. So everything I've talked about so far talks about this kind of system, the chasing system. I'm going to take you through exactly how the controller works. Based on this, you have some sort of stimulus geometry that we're able to measure with both these cameras and create this 3D map. We're able to take low-dimensional features that we think the animal will be able to measure. So that's things like the angular position or the angular rate or these kind of things that the eye can see. We then have some sort of feedback controller that takes the stimulus input and creates some behavioral output out of it. And then we have the actual behavioral output itself that we can measure. And so it's all about creating this model in the middle. And in between these two is the very important thing called the delay. That's the brain. That's the neural system, right? All of it is being modeled as, well, there's some delay in the middle. As, they count through the numbers and check exactly what behavior should happen. Not the way a neuroscientist would describe it, but how I'm going to talk about it. So how, if we use this model, do we describe it? Well, we have the velocity of the fly here, and we have it where it sees the target. We have this error angle. And this is another pursuit system. They're simply trying to point directly towards the target. So E is trying to be small. And so that means that the turn rate should be correlated to E. And so we should see that the larger that error angle is, the more that they're heading in the wrong direction, the more that we're getting a steering response. And actually that's beautifully linear in this system. The velocity turn rate, which is on your y-axis, is beautifully correlated with the actual error angle they're observing it at. This is actually what most of these systems were, the original study that most of these synth studies have been based on, was done in exactly this fly and found exactly this in 1974. We've got a nice linear gain, everything looks really dandy. What is there to still look at? This really, really, really well describes exactly what you're seeing here, which is the direction of where it's seeing the other target as being, time shifted by about 30 milliseconds later, the fly is pointing in the same direction. So if it saw it there 30 milliseconds ago, it's going to stop. It's going to be pointing there 30 milliseconds later. So really nice. What's weird? Well, the problem with this is that we're using the chaser velocity as the behavioral output. And that's not actually what the fly has control over. The fly controls its steering and changes its body. And flies also do this in a really weird way. You can think about two different types of turn. You can think about coordinated turn, which is what we tend to ask pilots, unless we're flying Ryanair, to do, is a coordinated turn where you gently point in the direction you should be going. That's good piloting. That's what you want. If your pilot starts doing this, well, I wouldn't advise you get out, but just generally try to take a different airline next time, because this is a skidding turn. That's turning your whole airstream, turning into the airstream, turning your whole body sideways. That's exactly what the fly does. As the fly makes this turn, you can see by this point here, he's at 90 degrees to the airstream with his body, which means his wings are also at a really weird angle. There's lots of weird things going on here. And actually you can get them turning their bodies up to 160 degrees from the direction in which they're traveling. So that's a fly that's flying backwards. Very short period of time, but that happens. The problem is, by this point, the body is ahead of the trajectory, and we've just been measuring the trajectory. So the body has a shorter delay because it's already turned by the time we measure that change. And so I said about doing this, which is measuring the body axis of the fly using the lovely cameras that I was very luckily able to take home and use in my kitchen. Less lucky for the people I was sharing a house with. It's very difficult to explain to people that, no, I want the windows open to let the flies in, please. But then we can look at interactions like this, where you've got these two flies flying past each other. Red is chasing blue. You see this real near pass where they're going to spin past each other. And red is going to make a body turn. It's a saccade here, which means a very, very sharp turn around to follow the target. And when we do this, and we just look at the line of sight versus the fly velocity, the directions, makes sense. Yeah, about 30 to 50 milliseconds looks fine, explained by our current model. What isn't explained by any of the current models is this, which is what the body axis is doing. The problem we have here is that is an extreme body saccade. 5,000, 6,000 degrees per second is how fast it's changing its body angle. And it's doing it 6 milliseconds after the target went straight past it. 6 milliseconds is really that doesn't start to make sense in terms of the time that it would take a neural system to react to this. I'm not a neuroscientist. I talk to lots and they say this is wrong. But I'm like, well, they're doing it. This is weird. And so actually suggests a more complex model. That while our models have worked to describe the behavior, maybe actually the mechanism is a little bit more complex than we're giving the tiny little housefly credit for. But what if they could just see the other, because this is created by your target, your opponent, making a turn. What if they can see that turn and that cues them in that there's a change coming? So I started doing this very, very high-tech target performance system where we've got a fake target, which is being controlled by the most amazing robot, moving it backwards and forwards here. And you can see that the fly is pursuing after this target. Can they still do it, even when it's just a perfect sphere? Because they shouldn't get visual cues as to the motion. They shouldn't see that turning behavior. And yes, again, they are, on average, in this case, 4 milliseconds delayed in terms of their target direction. Now, the delays, the way in which I'm doing the delays here, I can chat about delays later. Because the system is stochastic, and they're making very sharp changes, and then they're making no changes, and they're making sharp changes, delays are a little bit more complicated. But this certainly says that this model is not quite right as stands. They can't just be measuring current stimuli and then getting behavioral output in a time window that's that short. There's got to be an extra step. And one of the ways in which you could do this is you have a current stimuli, but instead of just fitting that in directly, you have some sort of predictive filter. I'm not talking about a big 3D model of exactly how the world works, but you might have some way in which you can measure from stimuli that you can see now, you could predict that your target is suddenly going to go from being in front of you to behind you, just based on the visual motion. But what that looks like, and what this fly is seeing that cues him into exactly what his target is about to do, is something that I would really like to look into in the future. And I think this is a great system to proceed with in a lab environment to really study the behaviors that I've been talking about so far and really start pushing in on a central question. But overall, I've told you about different chasing systems, and I hope you now see the kind of diversity of different chasing systems. You have these 3 different categories of chase. You have the predatory pursuit, which tends to be between species. There's a bit of cannibalism that happens in different systems. You have this kind of feeding interaction. And then you have here the territorial chases, asymmetric engagements between like animals. And they're very, very different. And we might expect even more extreme behavior here because you're competing against somebody who is able to react with the same sort of spectrum of maneuvers that you're able to do. And then finally, in between, we have the mate pursuit, which again is hard because we don't know much about how females are interacting in these engagements. And ultimately, I think the most interesting questions that are not addressed by any of the data I've shown so far is who wins and why do they win? Because all of these are about selecting who is going to win the interaction, especially when you're talking about male on male. And yet I don't have individual controls yet, and so I don't know who's winning. It certainly seems that bigger flies tend to win and all these kind of things, but how can we actually pull that out of the behavior and see how does behavior lead to success? So we have differences in perhaps behavioral strategy. Why these vary? Why are some chasing the current target location? Why are some of them chasing the future target location? Maneuverability, how does that vary between different taxa, and how is the behavior fitted to the actual maneuverability that system is able to do? And then finally, we have the reaction times. How are these minimized? And what can you measure now that's going to tell you about the future state? But also, how predictable is the future state? Yeah, all right, you might be able to predict 20 milliseconds in the future, but you're probably not going to predict 500 milliseconds because your target may move around a lot more. And all of these things may be underpinning and be kind of accessed by these kind of interactions. But also, I think fundamentally, we can start shifting away from single agent tasks, simply using this as a model to understand, well, how does sensory processing work when chasing? I say simply, it's a very complex, very rewarding aspect of the behavior, studying this kind of behavior. We can shift to much more multi-agent complex interactions. You can start actually well, is it because they're all fighting? I'm not sure I could necessarily directly call it collective behavior, but I think it certainly starts to approximate it when you have interactions that look like this. And this is a really complex airspace, and it's located directly above my compost bin. You have dozens of flies all interacting with these chases, these patrol routes, these different things, and all of this, in this case, they're trying to defend territory, they're trying to access females, and they're doing it through pursuit and through these individual interactions. And sometimes you have pursuits that involve up to 5 individuals. And so how do all of these different systems work, I think is really interesting and to go in the future. But I'll happily take any questions now and leave this pattern up. And when it's done, I'll put on some dragonflies in a second. But thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, can you explain again the constant K?
Of course, yes.
So you say it depends on the species. Can you explain? Is it purely sensory, or is that because of the mass and wing loading? And connected to this, in birds, what do you expect it to be constant as well, or other flying animals?
I do hope nobody has epilepsy, so I'm just going to go back through these. That is a fantastic question. So the gain that we stick in missiles tends to be between, it's a dimensionless gain. It's just a single number. It's how much you turn in proportion to a visual turning that you see in the target. By turning, I'm talking about angular rates. And I think, I went past it, sorry. So what exactly is K in this interaction? In fact, more normally it's called N. It doesn't really matter what you call it. But what affects your conversion of what you visually see into your behavior? And we can talk about tuning of the behavior, and it's a useful tool for talking that. I think what's really happening here is that they are experiencing different, for want of a better term, I would use dynamic ranges of stimulus. So the stimulus in the case of the robber fly, because they're looking at targets that are much further away, the angular rate is slower. I was talking about being on a train carriage. If you were chasing a mountain, the angular rates, so you might want to steer more in proportion to, if your mountain is shooting past, it means you're traveling at a real difference of rate. The killer fly, when they're right in close, they're experiencing much higher angular rates. So a way in which you could do this, if you imagine your maximum turn rate, where do you apply your maximum turn rate? You apply it at the maximum, presumably, of the visual stimulation that you're likely to get, the maximum angular rate of the target you're likely to see. So what I think has happened is it's about stretching your turn rates across the visual stimuli that you're likely to experience. That probably wasn't the clearest explanation, but I hope it's somewhat helpful. But there's other ways in which you could do it as well. And I think ultimately the actual change of maneuverability would affect the magnitude or the saturation of the y-axis, so where this might go flat, as we saw it did in the mayflies, not necessarily actually check the fundamental gain. In birds, the ones that have been looked at so far, peregrines and gear falcons, there's also a little bit of work in Harris hawks as well, they can be modeled by exactly the same steering system, and they come out with a gain that is tuned to their behavior. In peregrines, hunting at very long ranges, and they're actually hunting from above because they do this stooping behavior, and they go in down behind, they're much more tuned like the robber fly. If we look at the Harris's hawk, who's down in amongst the foliage and in amongst the forest, it looks a lot like a killer fly. Their gain is reduced because they're right in behind it. There's a few other aspects to that as well.
But fixed, so it's not changeable in any species of bird, because you were saying this for insects.
So it could change. This could be a very, we're still talking at a kind of very broad scale. There could be a lot of different complex factors. It's actually in terms of getting the data that's the hard bit to start picking apart. So one thing you might want to change your gain depending on distance. But do you know distance? And that's a really interesting question in the case of the insects. Do they actually know how far away the target is? Because we can trick them with big targets sometimes. But also with the birds, there's a question. They looked at naive gear falcons, or gyre falcons, however you want to say it, and compared them to the peregrine falcons. And the naive ones that haven't done as many hunts tuned their gain way lower. They ended up tail chasing their targets to go and catch them. Only in the kind of later stage of the more mature birds do they come in from sideways and remove the pigeon's head at 200 miles per hour. That happens, that might be a learning difference. Whether the flies are learning, who knows? They're a really good question. Thank you.
Hi, I just have a rather simple question about the houseflies that we were talking about.
Yeah.
I know you're trying to stick to very simple controllers to compare with your data. Did you try using like a PID controller just to see if that accounts for like the predictive aspect?
So in this instance, you're right that all of this is fitted along a sort of PID threshold. And this is really the D component of a PID. And the houseflies and the dragonflies I've been talking about more about the P component. So could we start adding D components? That actually still wouldn't shorten the time delay as we've seen, but you're right that a D system does look predictive. But the way in which the prediction work doesn't, the way in which prediction would advance your measured time state wouldn't explain it in this behavior, especially given that we're talking about what is a saccadic response rather than a continuous response. I don't really have the right slides to tell you about it, but I'd love to chat more about it later. Thank you.
I was wondering about the mayflies. When they start chasing the female, then the males also start moving horizontally because they're chasing the female, right?
Yep.
How do they not all end up chasing each other?
They do.
Okay,
Yep.
but
you get a ball of 10 male mayflies surrounding one hapless poor female. She's able to decline mating, so she can close her claspers and say, no, thank you, not interested. But you tend to get a big ball of males. The male that comes up from underneath and tries to capture her will loop his reflexive forelegs around her wings and will have the best opportunity to mate. But actually what you see is that one male will start chasing and then another male will start chasing that male, and you get these chains that happen. And at the end of them tends to be a female or a male that's just emerged who just happens to be flying past. But absolutely, that causes a massive destruction. And actually, if you have a bird that comes over, like a pigeon, the whole swarm goes, we're after that bird. And they give up after a while because the bird's traveling 10 meters per second and their top speed's 3. They won't catch it, but they'll give it a good shot. So you're absolutely right. That just seems to happen. It's rather weird that it's not more carefully balanced, but I think you're starting to see here that maybe you're pushing more of an element of speed of reaction or robustness. You're not applying a really complicated filter. You're chasing whatever goes because you don't have long to wait. And there might be, it's all a bit of a puzzle why it should be so simple and break so often. That's what I said. Yeah, great question.
Thanks so much, Sam, for this beautiful talk, really fascinating. And I understand Sam is still around to answer any questions. So please take advantage of it and enjoy the afternoon. Thank you so much for coming today.